Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, member of the Royal Academy, friends, I wish you a warm welcome this afternoon at this lecture organized by the Académie Royale de Belgique in partnership with the European External Service. We're delighted that this cycle of conference resumes physically and that we are all gathered today, at least for those who have the chance to live in Brussels or not far, in this beautiful Palais des Académies, and for those who are following us online, and there are numerous of them, a warm welcome as well. The topic of the day, as you all know, is Europe and the southern neighborhood, a very important topic for which we have the chance to have today two excellent speakers who will enlighten us about the intricacies of this complex relationship between the EU and its southern neighborhood. We will first listen to a lecture by Professor Jean-Pierre Filiu. Professor Filiu is an historian and a diplomat. He is teaching Middle East studies at Sciences Po Paris since 2006. But before joining the academic field, Professor Filiu was posted to various countries in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. He was posted to Jordan, he was posted to Syria, and finally to Tunisia as a minister consular. And before joining the diplomatic field, he had also various humanitarian missions in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. Professor Filiu is a prolific writer with about 20 books, many of them being translated into English. And I want just to quote some of them, like the one published in 2011, The Arab Revolution, the book published in 2014, Gaza, a History, the one published in 2015, From Deep State to Islamic State. Most recently, Professor Filiu, you have published Le Milieu des Mondes, which is a history of Middle East from the 4th century until today. It's not yet translated into English, but I'm sure it will be. And I'm delighted to underline the fact that your book, Algérie, la nouvelle indépendance, has been awarded the Paul Bouteiller Prize in 2020 by the Académie des Sciences d'Outre-mer in Paris, of which I am a member of. Professor Filiu is an Arabist, as we would say at the State Department, not just because he knows the Middle East, but because he speaks fluently Arabic, since he graduated from l'Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, LANGZO, as we say, in Arabic and in Chinese. Our second speaker is a committed and visionary physicist, Professor Fawzia Farida Sharfi, who not only is a scientist, but also a prolific writer. And I like to underline a prize that you received, Madam, in 2016 by the French-Spanish Association Mujeres, the prize Femmes Avenir. On that occasion, it was said that you are a lady with a global vision, a scientist of extraordinary caliber, and a great Tunisian writer. You are known, Professor Chalfi, to be a defensor, a vibrant defensor of science and the autonomy of thought against dogmatic vision. You have, among others, published a book under the title L'Islam et la science, en finir avec les compromis, and more recently, Sacrée question pour un islam d'aujourd'hui. I should not forget to mention that for a brief term, you have been twice junior minister, secrétaire d'État, in the first and second government of Tunisia after the revolution in the Ministry of Higher Education. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we will dedicate the first hour to our two speakers, and roughly around 6 p.m., we will start the Q&A. As a way to introduce the topic of the day, I like to say that the challenges in the Middle East and North Africa region encapsulate in intense form the trends in the EU external action. In the last several years, other powers have pursued assertive diplomatic policies, and the European Union has lost, I believe, much geostrategic weight in the region. The prospect of deep integration and a meaningful community of values being developed between Europe and the Middle East, Eastern, Northern Africa states has all but evaporated. The EU's strategic vision towards the Arab world has narrowed. I do hope that our two speakers today, after analyzing the situation between the EU and the southern neighborhood, will give us some reasons to hope. I thank you. May I invite Professor Filiu to take the floor?
So thank you so much to the Royal Academy, to the Brussels International College, and to the External Service for giving me the privilege to speak tonight in front of you in Brussels with your various connection with European movers and shakers. I was supposed to speak about how large is the sea between us, since I'm talking from the northern shore of the Mediterranean. I will dedicate my talk to a sea between us, but a sea of incomprehension with a big question mark. Reflection on the fall of two walls. It has been now more than 10 years that a question has been haunting me, and I am sincerely grateful to my guests for giving me the privilege to address it tonight in front of you. This question is the following one. Why the Europeans who reacted empathetically to the fall of the Berlin Wall didn't understand in 2011 that the fall of the wall of fear in the Arab world had also a long-term impact on their very future as Europeans. Nobody in his right mind would have dared to claim in 1989 that stability and security were depending on the preservation of the communist rule, since the democratic transition was perceived as the only way not only to end the authoritarian nightmare, but also to ensure long-term stability through the rule of law. But in 2011, and until today, many Europeans' voices were heard and are still heard advocating the dictatorial status quo in the Arab world as the only option to safeguard a stability that became synonymous with the denial of popular demands. Of course, I could turn back as a historian on a long legacy of European denial of Arab rights. While the Arabs had chosen during World War I to join the French and the British to fight in the Middle East, the Ottoman army, advised and sometimes led by German officers, they were not treated as allies after the victory and the subsequent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. On the contrary, the constitutional Arab kingdom that was established in Damascus in 1918 was toppled 2 years later by the French, who carved up the region with the British in the League of Nations mandates. However, despite this imperialist coup de force, Arab elites and societies managed to run during decades political systems that allowed a modicum of party pluralism, parliamentary elections, and freedoms of press. But those elites, instead of being supported by the European powers, were, because of their nationalism, victims of a kind of an attrition war that left them exhausted when they reached the long-awaited independence. They were therefore too weak to resist the hijacking of those Arab independences by military cliques who, starting in 1949 in Syria, then in 1952 in Egypt, took pretext of the ongoing conflict with Israel to liquidate the parliamentary system and establish a one-party rule. This cycle of coups ended in 1969 in Libya, when Colonel Gaddafi toppled King Idris al-Senussi, who had secured not only the independence, but also the unity of the country in 1951. It is logical that those despots did their utmost to erase the very memory of their far more tolerant predecessors. It is more puzzling that in Europe, the cliché that Arabs have no historical precedents of pluralistic and/or parliamentary experiences is still so widespread. This cliché has nurtured serious misconceptions that led in turn to serious miscalculations. The so-called Arab Springs were not a fleeting season of popular lyricism. They were part of a region-wide Arab revolution, a series of democratic uprisings whose standard slogan was "Eshab Yurid Isqatanism." The people want to topple the regime. They don't want the fall of the regime. They want to topple the regime. This explicitly revolutionary slogan stemmed from the collective desire to reopen the gates of democratic transition that had been closed by decades of dictatorial rule. It was a popular call to revert to full-fledged national independences after their military hijacking had frustrated during generations the various people from their right to self-determination. In Libya, the insurgents in February 2011 raised the flag of the Senussi dynasty, not because they dreamt of restoring the monarchy, but because they wanted to liquidate the legacy of 4 decades of Gaddafi-only rule. The following months, the Syrian protesters raised the 3-star flag of their national independence against the 2-star flag of the Assad regime. Everybody in Europe had understood, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the patriotic surge that accelerated the collapse of the pro-Soviet bloc in a domino effect where Hungarians, Czechs, or Lithuanians, and defended their right of self-determination against bankrupt regimes and eventually toppled them in regional dynamics that never erased the national peculiarities. But very few on our continent grasp the long-term dynamics of Arab popular movements that aspired beyond the toppling of the local dictators to fulfill at last their right of self-determination after decades of the ruling clique treating the country and its national resources as private property. The wall of fear had fallen, and it was a historical turning point in the Arab world where the one-party or hegemonic party rule had been imposed for so long through the brutal control of the mukhabarat, literally the intelligence services. The Arabic word is generally translated by security services, while I think insecurity services should be more appropriate, assuming that their central mission was to spread insecurity at the very heart of the civil society. Peaceful marchers had risked their lives in defying the terror machine of the ruling clique. Hundreds, even thousands had died, but their resolve had forced first Ben Ali in Tunisia in January 2011, then Mubarak in Egypt the following months, to flee, inspiring protest movement in many other countries. Confronted with such a political tsunami, High Representative Catherine Ashton and Commissioner Jean-Pierre Filiu launched on behalf of the European Union in March 2011 a partnership for democracy and shared prosperity south of the Mediterranean. Interestingly, what is supposed to be shared in the nearest future is the prosperity, while the core values of the rule of law and democratic freedoms are not spontaneously shared. Contrary to the massive help that had followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, no new financial instrument was planned to complement the existing neighbourhood policy tools. More for more was a mantra that was supposed to offer additional help to countries that followed the path of reforms. The new strategy, announced by the European Commission in May 2011, called for deep and sustainable democracy, SIC, whose one of the 5 pillars was, again I quote, the democratic control of armed and security forces. The colossal challenge that such a democratic control represented was not even addressed in detail. It was a mere benchmark of democratic performance, even though the multifaceted interference of the military apparatus was and remains the major threat in many Arab countries. Along with revolutionary Tunisia and Egypt, Morocco and Jordan were also privileged by the European decision makers because of the advanced status of their partnership, a bias that could be justified by the new constitution endorsed by popular referendum in Morocco in July 2011, while the Jordanian monarch opposed even limited reforms. Also in July 2011, Lady Ashton launched in Cairo the 300 million euro SPRING program, SPRING standing for Support for Partnership Reform and Inclusive Growth. Well, I met many people in the Arab world who are ready to die for what they believe. I never met anybody who is ready to die for inclusive growth. Those very prudent moves fell obviously far below the minimum that was required from Europe to meet such a historical challenge. However, the inertia was less bureaucratic than ideological, which brings me back to my haunting question. Long before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the then European community had lavishly financed the post-authoritarian transitions of Spain, Portugal, and Greece before eventually integrating them. But the same reasoning seemed not to apply to the Arab world. And the very idea that the same destiny, based on the same values, was to be shared on both sides of the Mediterranean appeared incongruous, even blasphemous to many. There had been one time when European and Arab opinions had vibrated together, echoing the same refusal of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. But such a massive meeting of minds had suffered from the political divide between the leaderships of France and Germany, adamant in their opposition to the war, and those of Great Britain, Italy, Spain, or Poland, joining the occupying coalition in Iraq. Another political divide, strikingly different, occurred in February 2011 when French and British forces joined the NATO campaign in Libya, while Germany and Italy opposed the war. So, divisions at the top could explain the European collective cautiousness. But I do believe the problem is much deeper and stems from the relative lack of empathy after the fall of the wall of fear in the Arab world, especially compared with the spontaneous and active solidarity with the East European societies who were fighting for their freedoms after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It had to be a spring, and it had to end as soon as possible in order to restore the much-awaited stability. Instead of welcoming the diversity of opinion and the multiplication of parties as an indicator of a sound and vibrant civil society, some nurtured a clear nostalgia of the Ancien Régime, where gongos, the infamous governmental NGOs, saved the time of checking the solidity of potential partners. While the process of institutional building is always long and complex, with its ups and downs, others tending to favor an instant democracy that was not essentially different from the one Washington tried and failed lamentably to promote in Iraq. The basic mistake equating democratic transition with quick elections was widespread. The only concern that slowed down such a push for ballots was the fear of an Islamist victory. The European Union had proved in the past that despite funding and certifying the result of a free and fair election, it was not always ready to work with the winner. Hamas had clearly and unexpectedly won the Palestinian parliamentary election in January 2006. But the European leaders conditioned their working with the local Islamists on their recognition of Israel, their endorsement of previous Israeli-Palestinian agreements, and their renunciation to violence. Those three conditions were all and remain reasonable, but they should have been imposed on any party joining the EU-sponsored election, not just to the unexpected winner. The Palestinian and Arab opinions felt already then that Europeans were twisting the democratic rules, accepting to deal with an elected body only when this body fit their own standards. And the dilemma was even tougher in 2011, when Islamists were expected to win the first free elections in Tunisia and in Egypt. Such an announced victory was grounded on the strong networks of the Islamist parties, while newly formed groups were lacking such a grassroots base. On top of that, Islamists could appeal to the revolutionary voters as the historical opponent to the regime, but also to the conservative voters as the best safeguard of some kind of a moral order. But there was a big but. While European leaders were focusing on the Islamist elephant in the room, they forgot that past experiences had proven that Islamists could win the first election but would lose the second one, because of the clash between their own dogma and the daily ruling of a country. In Jordan, where the Muslim Brothers and their allies had scored a relative majority at the parliamentary election in 1989, they had been defeated 4 years later. And in Tunisia, Ennahda lost 1/3 of its voters between the October 2011 election to the Constituent Assembly and the October 2014 parliamentary elections. In Egypt, the countershock was even more impressive for the Muslim Brotherhood, that lost half of its voters between the fall 2011 parliamentary election and the first round of the presidential elections in May 2012. If they managed to win the second round, it is only because of the polarization of such a vote between the Islamist candidate and the former general who had been Mubarak's last prime minister. So it was less an Islamist vote than an anti-Mubarak vote that gave 51.7% to Mohamed Morsi, the first Egyptian president elected in a free and fair election, and so far the last one. But instead of governing as a ruler of all Egyptians, Morsi acted like a party leader, trampling on public liberties. Such a dismal record would have spelled defeat for the Muslim Brotherhood in the following elections. But General Abdel Fattah Sisi, whom Morsi had appointed Minister of Defense, preferred to topple Morsi on July 3, 2013, brutally closing the 30 months parenthesis of post-Mubarak transition. Catherine Ashton proposed a mediation between Morsi and Sisi, along with her US counterpart, John Kerry. Those joint European-US efforts collapsed on August 14, when Sisi decided to liquidate the pro-Morsi gatherings in 2 Cairo squares. The bloodbath, with hundreds of people killed, was the worst since the then General Bonaparte had invaded Egypt in 1798 and crushed a nationalist uprising in the capital city. 1 week later, Bashar al-Assad, emboldened by Sisi's impunity, ordered chemical weapons to be used, mixed with classical rockets, against rebel-held suburbs of Damascus, killing some 1,400 people, overwhelmingly civilians. This mass murder was only the culmination of a constant escalation of the war waged by the Syrian dictator against his own people, with the unconditional and active support of Russia and Iran. Confronted in March 2011 with an unprecedented wave of peaceful protesters, Assad had consistently labeled them as terrorists and launched a ruthless repression of any kind of dissent. The grassroots and horizontal network of local coordination committees and Tansikiyat that structured the revolutionary movement was able to survive this repressive campaign. But such a structure, once the regime's brutality left the armed struggle as the only option, led to a fragmentation of local militias strongly entrenched in their own constituency, but unable to join a clear-cut chain of command. The European and American refusal to grant international recognition to the anti-Assad political body, contrary to what had been done in Libya with the anti-Gaddafi Transitional Council, only increased the military fragmentation. This was why Assad believed he could deliver a deadly blow to the Syrian resistance through the chemical strikes. US President Barack Obama had claimed a year before that any use of chemical weapons in Syria would mean crossing a red line and call for the appropriate American retaliation. The anti-Assad coalition had then reacted quite negatively against what it described as a blank check that allowed the regime any kind of mass destruction, providing it restrained from using gas. But when gas was indeed sprayed on Syrian civilians, Obama decided to back down. And since the House of Commons had voted against any British participation, French President François Hollande was left on his own. Even though France was able militarily to strike alone the Assad regime, it could not do so politically as a former mandatory power over Syria, since any isolated French move would have been targeted and resented as a blatant form of neocolonialism. So Assad's impunity in Syria now matched Sisi's impunity in Egypt, this one echoing Bonaparte's massacres in the streets of Cairo 2 centuries ago, while that one could only be compared with Tamerlan, Timur, bloodbath in Syria at the very beginning of the 15th century. nowhere had the Arab counter-revolutionary wave been able to restore the status quo prevailing before the fall of the wall of fear in early 2011. Sisi's regime was far more brutal than Mubarak's, with the repression against Islamists soon targeting any kind of opposition, even liberal or secularist, while Assad Jr. had achieved an even more bloody record than his already ruthless father. The fall of the wall of fear had left the Arabs, but also the Europeans, with the historical alternative between, on one side, democratic transition in the Arab world, or on the other, escalating violence to unprecedented levels of horror. The dictatorial impasse became therefore the breeding ground for the jihadist challenge. The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, established a few months before the Damascus chemical attacks, used them as a major tool of recruitment, especially here in Europe, claiming that Muslims could only be defended by Muslims, since such mass killing had triggered no military reaction from the Western democracies. So ISIS ranks began to swell with foreign volunteers, allowing this jihadi outfit to launch in May 2014 here in Brussels, against the Jewish Museum, its European terror campaign that would extend over the next 3 years to France, Germany, Sweden, the UK or Spain, Brussels being struck again in March 2016. On top of that, the descent of Syria into hell triggered in the summer of 2015 the so-called refugee crisis, with hundreds of thousands of people desperate enough to cross over Europe by any means. The direct intervention of Russia in Syria from September 2015 onwards only aggravated the dynamics of mass migration from the Middle East to Central and Western Europe. While Arab dictators had claimed to sometimes welcoming European ears that they were the only rampart defending Europe from chaos and terror, it became now crystal clear that those dictators were in fact the main cause of the chaos and the terror that could not even spare Europe. In addition to that, Russian President Vladimir Putin had been convinced by Obama's refusal to implement his own red lines that the West was now too weak to stand by his own principle. 6 months after the Damascus chemical bombings, Russian tanks moved into the Ukrainian province of Crimea, eventually annexing it in March 2014. And the current invasion of the rest of Ukraine that started on February 24, 2022, 2 months and 1 day ago already, saw the Russian military massively use against the Ukrainian resistance war techniques that had been successfully tested in Syria. Systematic bombings of civilian institutions in order to force the civilian population to flee. Humanitarian corridors, that's the deadliest oxymoron I ever heard, that became deadly traps for desperate refugees. Carpet bombing propaganda to caricature the enemy as Nazi in Ukraine, the same way the whole Syrian opposition was labeled terrorist, and so on and so forth. The catastrophe of an all-out war spreading from the south of the Mediterranean to Eastern Europe was only enhanced by the European inability to assimilate the long-term shockwaves of the fall of the Berlin Wall with the long-term shockwave of the fall of the wall of fear in the Arab world, an inability whose collective price is still to be paid in full. The self-proclaimed realist, another oxymoron, who pretended that in Syria, Europe had no dog in this fight, are therefore exposed as dramatically disconnected from the trans-Mediterranean reality now that the ordeal of Mariupol in 2022 is routinely compared to the one Aleppo endured in 2016 under comparable Russian shelling. The challenge is not anymore about shared prosperity, but about shared destiny between the two shores of the Mediterranean, and how the people of the southern shore could be assisted into benefiting from the values they aspire to share with the people of the north, namely rule of law and public liberties. Once this perspective is genuinely accepted and the urgency is obvious, the European Union has yet to fathom a policy that will meet such a challenge and try to compensate for all the time lost since the historical opportunity of the fall of the Arab Wall of Fear has been missed. And as was kindly said during the presentation, I'm a former diplomat. I was even former diplomatic advisor to Minister of Interior, Minister of Defense, Prime Minister during the 9/11 crisis. So I have policy recommendation, a minimal option and a maximal option. They can be outlined in the central realm of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. First, because the European Union has repeatedly stressed its strategic commitment to the two-state solution. Second, because any gesture towards the Palestinian people will resonate among all the Arab people, who are less keen than many of their leaders to abandon the Palestinian cause. An indication of that grassroots sensitivity to the fate of the Palestinian people is the fact that the Palestinian flag is often the second one being raised along the local national flag during popular protest. And it is only time to correct the conventional wisdom according to which in the Middle East, I quote, US decide, UN feed, and EU pays. End of the quote. The minimal option, would be the opening, under European supervision, of a sea route between the Gaza Strip and Cyprus. That would represent a limited but much welcomed alternative to the two current land gateways of Eretz towards Israel and Rafah towards Egypt. Such a gesture would demonstrate that the European Union is concretely committed to alleviate the plight of more than 2 million Palestinians collectively besieged since 2007, with an overwhelming majority of them knowing only the Strip as a permanent horizon of their whole existence. I was in Gaza last month, so I can really testify about that. Since this was especially true for the Gazan students, the Gazan youth, whose life experience is now defined by the barbed wire walls and electric fences delimiting this Palestinian territory. The European Union has been financing, it is financing right now, since 2005, a border assistance mission, UBAM Rafah, whose action at the gateway to Egypt was suspended in 2007 when Hamas took over militarily the Gaza Strip, expelling the Palestinian Authority and brutally imposing its sole rule on the territory. UBAM Rafah's mission should be reoriented on the monitoring of a sea international terminal at the Gaza port that would operate only to Cyprus. As was the case in Rafah from 2005 to 2007, UBAM would operate in close coordination with Israel and the Palestinian Authority without any official recognition of Hamas. Israel has a vested interest in diffusing the pressure inside the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority could therefore manifest a concrete solidarity with the Gaza population who feels largely neglected by Ramallah. This would give an unprecedented credit to the Europeans in Gaza and strengthen their repeated and legitimate call for the disbanding of Hamas armed wing, the Qassam brigades. That's the easy one. Now the maximal option. Suspension of any aid to the Palestinian Authority until general elections are held for the first time since 2005 for the presidency and 2006 for the parliament. The European Union, as the main funder and by far of the Palestinian Authority should not tolerate the denial of any democratic accountability by the current Palestinian leadership in Ramallah. The Palestinian Authority, far from being the basis of a future Palestinian state, has mainly become a bankrupt and corrupt entity associated with an all-intrusive security apparatus. Only general elections can revivify this otherwise dysfunctional and extremely costly political structure. The scheduling of those elections in 2021 had led to a massive wave of voters' registration, a clear indication of popular interest and potential participation. It is also worth reminding that the postponement, sine die, and de facto cancellation of those elections by the Palestinian leadership in April 2021 contributed to the escalation that led the following months to a new and destructive cycle of Israeli-Palestinian violence. The European Union should not shy away from this showdown with the Palestinian Authority, nor accept the blame for a potential humanitarian catastrophe. It is the ongoing status quo that is actually fueling such a catastrophe, since it is forbidding any decent development of the Palestinian territories. On top of that, if the European Union would move from being a benevolent but discreet banker to asserting its central role in any negotiated process, it would greatly enhance its profile in the whole region and I believe beyond. I could elaborate, but I know that my time is out, so we'll just conclude. These two options, along with many others, are on the table. If only the European Union considers that any euro spent south of the Mediterranean is not a generous gift, but a contribution to the long-term European interest north and south of the Mediterranean. In this modest presentation, I hope I could at least outline a way out of the sea of incomprehension that still remains between us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Filiu, for this brilliant exposé, thought-provoking, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Mais je voudrais maintenant inviter le professeur Charfi à faire son exposé en français, je crois.
Merci beaucoup. Merci aussi de me permettre de parler dans une langue que j'affectionne, le français. Et merci au professeur Didier Vincent, au professeur Mariotello, de me donner la possibilité de participer à cette séance du Bruxelles International College sur les relations de l'Union européenne et ses voisins du Sud. Et c'est l'occasion pour moi d'intervenir suite à la brillante, remarquable conférence de Jean-Pierre Filiu, que j'ai connu il y a une vingtaine d'années, quand il était en poste à Tunis, dans des circonstances assez difficiles déjà à l'époque, pour nous. Jean-Pierre Filiu nous a proposé, donc c'est une lecture très approfondie des relations entre l'Union européenne et le monde arabe, et sa connaissance approfondie du Moyen-Orient est très précieuse dans le contexte actuel dominé par la guerre, ici et là, la violence, les conflits. Sa mise en perspective de la chute du mur de Berlin et celle de la chute du mur de la peur dans le monde arabe en 2011 est particulièrement pertinente. Je partage le questionnement du professeur Jean-Pierre Filiu sur l'attitude des Européens face à ces deux bouleversements. Dans le premier, ils ont manifesté leur empathie et une solidarité spontanée et active avec les sociétés de l'Europe de l'Est, luttant pour leur liberté après la chute du mur de Berlin. Dans le deuxième, ce fut la prudence collective et l'attente d'une stabilité rapidement rétablie après ce qui fut dénommé les printemps arabes. 2011 a été plus qu'un printemps. 2011 est un tournant historique pour le monde arabe. Le désir de liberté et la quête d'être gouverné autrement, d'être gouverné démocratiquement, était le point de départ. La suite fut vécue différemment suivant les pays, qualifiés d'arabes parce qu'ils ont en commun la langue arabe, mais si différents par ailleurs si on se réfère au rôle de l'armée, aux structures sociales, aux droits de la famille, à la relation entre modernité et tradition, des différences qui ont beaucoup compté dans les récents développements. L'Europe a suivi de près ce tournant historique. Y a-t-il eu alors de sa part le grand élan de solidarité que les pays ont à l'égard de ceux qu'ils considèrent proches d'eux? L'annonce que la haute représentante Catherine Ashton et le commissaire Stefan Füle ont lancée en mars 2011 au nom de l'Union européenne comporte des termes qui peuvent nous donner des éléments de réponse. Un partenariat pour la démocratie et une prospérité partagée au sud de la Méditerranée. Jean-Pierre Filiu note à juste titre que ce qui est censé être partagé dans un avenir proche est la prospérité. Alors que les valeurs fondamentales de l'état de droit et des libertés démocratiques ne sont pas spontanément partagées. Je vais poursuivre sur la question du partage des valeurs, qui est le lien fort entre ceux qui, à travers le monde, se battent pour la reconnaissance des droits individuels, de la liberté d'expression, de la liberté de pensée, de la liberté de conscience. Comment définir ces valeurs aujourd'hui? Sont-elles universelles ou sont-elles occidentales, comme le déclarent certaines voix européennes, parce qu'elles sont nées en Occident et qu'en conséquence, leur origine doit nécessairement leur être associée? Ceux qui, aujourd'hui, adhèrent à ces valeurs, comme moi, n'ont pas pour autant besoin de se détacher de l'histoire et du patrimoine culturel de leur pays. Ils défendent le respect de l'individu et prônent l'adhésion au principe d'un État moderne, un État construit par la loi et le droit et non par la norme religieuse. Un État qui ne doit pas céder à ceux qui refusent l'adoption et le respect des valeurs universelles sous prétexte qu'elles seraient associées à un monde qui serait étranger à leur culture. Ces derniers clament leur adhésion à la démocratie. Mais la démocratie ne se limite pas à un processus électoral. Elle doit également signifier l'état de droit dont je viens de parler et inscrire les droits humains, droits et libertés individuelles comme fondement d'une société démocratique. Ce que les pays des printemps arabes ont à accomplir pour assurer cet objectif ne peut se suffire d'un appui à une démocratie instantanée. Je rejoins totalement Jean-Pierre Filiu lorsqu'il souligne l'erreur largement répandue qui consiste à assimiler transition démocratique et élection rapide. Et sur ce point, je voudrais ajouter que la Tunisie a bénéficié de la part de l'Union européenne d'un soutien financier appréciable pour la préparation des élections, pour l'accompagnement au processus électoral, à travers le soutien financier de nombreuses associations créées après 2011. L'étape des élections est cruciale. C'est le premier pas de la transition démocratique, mais ce n'est qu'un premier pas. Après la focalisation sur le processus électoral et les résultats des élections, vient le temps de la construction démocratique. Celle-ci s'est avérée bien plus complexe que ne l'imaginaient les auteurs, les acteurs de la révolution de 2011 et tous les citoyens, tous en attente de travail, liberté, dignité, les trois mots d'ordre de la révolution tunisienne. Du côté des dirigeants européens, La focalisation sur la préparation des élections a d'une certaine manière conduit à minimiser, d'une part, les écueils à venir pour la réalisation des objectifs démocratiques et d'autre part, l'urgence des revendications d'ordre économique pour mettre fin aux inégalités sociales, aux disparités régionales à l'origine de la révolution tunisienne. Aujourd'hui, un peu plus de 10 années après la révolution, la situation économique est extrêmement préoccupante. Le rêve tunisien a disparu. Nous avions vu revenir au cours de l'année 2011 des jeunes Tunisiens établis à l'étranger, pleins d'espoir et de projets pour leur pays en pleine effervescence. Il y avait à faire partout en Tunisie et dans tous les domaines, et la liberté acquise semblait pour nombre de Tunisiens suffisante quant à la réussite de la transition démocratique. Que reste-t-il de cette image de leur pays, de mon pays, de l'espoir immense qui avait initié ce retour au pays natal? C'est une question que beaucoup de Tunisiens se posent en regard du triste constat de l'augmentation de candidats au départ. Pourquoi partent-ils? Les adolescents pensent que les études ne mènent à rien. Les jeunes ont perdu confiance, ils ont perdu l'espoir de trouver un emploi qui va de pair avec la dignité, un des 3 slogans de la Révolution. Les jeunes couples sont aussi candidats au départ, même s'ils ont une bonne situation professionnelle. Beaucoup sont ingénieurs, médecins. Ils ne partent pas parce que les pays du nord de la Méditerranée les attirent. Ils ne partent pas parce que ces pays correspondent à leurs idéaux. Ils partent pour assurer l'avenir de leurs enfants. Ils sont soucieux de pouvoir garantir leurs futures études supérieures, convaincus du prestige des universités européennes. Ils quittent ainsi leur pays, la Tunisie, qui avait misé dès l'indépendance sur l'éducation, l'enseignement supérieur, un choix prioritaire avec celui de la santé, et n'accordant au budget de la défense qu'une part relativement secondaire. Ce pays a formé ces jeunes couples, ces jeunes cadres, qui décident aujourd'hui de partir. Il leur a assuré leur avenir en leur donnant les compétences qu'ils vont faire valoir dans les pays d'accueil de l'autre côté de la Méditerranée. Ces départs sont la manifestation d'une sorte d'auto-sabotage. Et les atouts de leur pays sont potentiels, sont obscurcis par une crise de confiance. Il y a donc urgence à faire face à ce constat d'échec. La Tunisie est un petit pays, mais sa position au cœur de la Méditerranée lui donne un statut particulier pour l'équilibre de la région. Elle n'est pas que méditerranéenne, elle est africaine. Ce double caractère entraîne que les pays du nord de la Méditerranée sont directement concernés par les turbulences possibles du fait de fortes revendications économiques ou d'actions terroristes. Il y a donc urgence. Il faut retrouver la confiance dans l'avenir. La sortie de la délicate période que vit la Tunisie risque de prendre du temps. Elle ne se résoudra pas facilement. Elle implique une réponse qui exige du travail, qui ne se limite pas à la proposition de projets, ni à celle de leur accompagnement. Il faudra aller plus loin que l'accompagnement. Il faudra également en assurer une réalisation durable. C'est cette exigence de réalisation que l'on peut attendre de la coopération avec l'Union européenne, qui suppose une grande volonté et un fort engagement. Les 2 domaines à privilégier sont l'économie et l'éducation. Le haut représentant de l'Union européenne pour les affaires étrangères et la politique de sécurité et vice-président de la Commission européenne, Josep Borrell, soulignait en décembre dernier, à l'occasion de la journée de la Méditerranée, que par-dessus tout, il importe d'améliorer les conditions d'existence et de mettre l'accent sur la création d'emplois et la croissance économique en vue d'un développement économique et humain plus inclusif. L'accent mis sur l'accélération de la transition verte gagnerait à être concrétisé le plus rapidement possible au bénéfice réciproque des 2 rives de la Méditerranée. Il pourrait stimuler un nouvel élan dans un processus, dans un contexte plutôt dominé par la lassitude, le découragement, le désenchantement et il pourrait concerner particulièrement les jeunes et les femmes. Le deuxième domaine prioritaire est celui de l'éducation. Il ne s'agit pas d'interférer avec les politiques nationales éducatives et les réformes en cours ou en projet, mais de contribuer à l'amélioration de l'enseignement des langues étrangères. J'ai évoqué les difficultés des jeunes à trouver un emploi. Le chômage touche en grande partie les jeunes diplômés. L'amélioration de leur formation est un sujet préoccupant, en particulier celle de leur niveau de langue est un des moyens envisagés pour une formation plus adéquate au marché de l'emploi. Pour les générations à venir, il faut sérieusement prendre en compte le fait que la maîtrise des langues étrangères est un facteur déterminant pour l'insertion professionnelle au vu de leur importance dans le secteur économique. Le développement des technologies et leur impact dans de nombreux secteurs d'activité économique ont modifié le monde du travail. De plus en plus de métiers nécessitent des compétences techniques et un meilleur apprentissage des langues. C'est un changement qui doit être sérieusement pris en compte dans les solutions à proposer pour favoriser l'emploi des jeunes. Il faut prendre en compte le fait qu'il n'y a pas égalité des chances dans le recrutement entre ceux qui maîtrisent des langues étrangères et ceux qui ne les maîtrisent pas. Et cette source d'inégalité touche de manière plus forte les jeunes défavorisés du fait de leur statut socio-économique et ou du fait de leur éloignement des grands centres urbains. Améliorer leurs compétences linguistiques peut contribuer à réduire l'échec scolaire et à faciliter leur insertion professionnelle. À cette exigence concrète d'acquisition de compétences, j'ajouterai une raison fondamentale pour réactiver l'enseignement des langues étrangères. C'est l'ouverture sur le monde, la connaissance de l'autre. À travers ces enseignements, il y a échange, il y a partage, il y a aussi la découverte d'autres civilisations, d'autres cultures, d'autres religions. Il y a la découverte du patrimoine culturel universel. C'est un enseignement pour le partage du savoir, mais aussi pour le partage des valeurs de liberté. C'est à l'école, au collège, au lycée que l'on peut donner du sens à la mondialisation que tous les jeunes vivent, en leur donnant plus de clés d'accès à la découverte d'autres cultures. Pour toutes ces raisons, la coopération entre l'Union européenne et les pays du Maghreb pourrait être précieuse pour les deux parties sur la question de l'enseignement des langues étrangères et plus précisément sur l'utilisation du numérique pour cet enseignement. Le numérique peut être un moyen efficace pour le rénover, l'améliorer, le rendre plus attractif. De plus, l'outil numérique peut être mis en action rapidement à grande échelle si la volonté d'action sur ce projet est forte. C'est aussi un moyen qui peut être mis à profit pour l'apprentissage des langues étrangères par l'amélioration des performances à l'oral, à l'instar des laboratoires de langue, et il peut être également opérationnel pour l'amélioration des performances d'expression écrite. Ce projet peut être considéré comme non urgent aujourd'hui, mais chaque année gagnée sur le temps long des changements du système éducatif concerne des milliers d'élèves qui vont en bénéficier. C'est ce qui justifie l'urgence d'un projet dont les résultats n'apparaîtront qu'à moyen, voire à long terme. Dans le cadre de cette coopération entre l'Union européenne et les voisins du Sud autour de l'enseignement des langues étrangères, différentes actions peuvent être engagées pour approcher les enfants des deux rives de la Méditerranée, de leur permettre de mieux se connaître. Des échanges dans la langue étrangère avec des groupes d'élèves de différentes écoles, voire d'écoles de pays différents peuvent être développés. Ils seraient encadrés par les institutions scolaires et pourraient être consacrés à différents thèmes à développer. Que de sujets pourraient mobiliser les enfants dans ces échanges, des sujets d'actualité, l'environnement, le climat, les nouvelles technologies, mais aussi la passionnante histoire de la Méditerranée. Peut-être qu'en portant notre regard sur nos enfants, sur de possibles échanges qui susciteront leur curiosité, leur envie de mieux se connaître, nous pourrions envisager l'avenir des deux rives de la Méditerranée avec plus de confiance dans notre avenir commun. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup pour cet exposé, professeur Charfi, convaincant et profond. Le temps est venu de l'échange des questions-réponses. Je vais prendre les questions tant en provenance de la salle que celles qui nous sont communiquées en ligne. Voilà. Je vais peut-être d'abord prendre connaissance de ceci. Très bien, mais je vais d'abord commencer par la salle. And I will move back to English, and I assume Professor Shafi will be able to answer the question as well in English. If not, we will translate. Sir, you want to start? But if before you start, I will take 3 questions in a row. Thank you very much. Please. You need a microphone?
Good evening. My name is Alain Olium. I'm working for the European External Action Service. I'm now working in strategic foresight and policy planning, but for a decade, starting with the 2011 creation of the EEAS, which coincided with the Arab Spring. I worked as advisor to the managing director for Middle East and North Africa. So the joint communication, which you've been referring to, March of 2011 is very near to my heart, and was something which I worked very hard on for many months. Unfortunately, as you said, it didn't meet its expectations, but I'll leave that for another day, or maybe a book perhaps in the future. Mario could inspire me to write it. Just a few comments, if I may. First of all, both of you, I think, compared the reaction of Europe to the fall of the wall in '89 and the fall of the wall of fear, if you will, as you very well termed it, in the Arab world. You said, I think, Professor Filiu, that there was nobody in the world who tried to challenge what was happening after '89, that there should be an emphasis on security and stability. As somebody who is from Estonia, one of the countries which managed to benefit from this revolution, I can tell you that's not true. If there was certainly a reaction against the reunification of Germany, even from France and the then leaders of France and the UK, Thatcher and Mitterrand, it's been shown, it's documented that they were against it, and it took a while to convince them otherwise. Let me also just remind you of the so-called Chicken Kiev speech of Bush #1, where he came to Ukraine and told them to please calm down, don't fight for your independence, because we have to support Gorbachev in the name of stability and security. Have patience, he will reform. So I think, first of all, if I may just challenge that assertion, that it was not so true, that it wasn't universally welcomed. On second point, as far as the comparison again between what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in '89 to '91 to what happened in the Arab world, I think for one who was very close to the decision-making and policy-making at that time, I think for me, also looking at the two situations, I think the mistake was not that, but rather the opposite, that political leaders at the time in Europe wanted to see a parallel between what happened in Europe in '89-91 and what was happening in 2011. And this was a huge mistake, because the historical, the cultural, and political context, what happened in Europe at the '89 to '91 period and what happened in the Arab world were completely different. And I think the biggest mistake was that everybody expected, not everybody, but many of the leaders, it was a kind of euphoria. There were special meetings of the European Council at the time in early 2011, and there was an expectation that there would be a similar, very rapid liberation of the countries of the Arab world. And this was completely unfounded, in my view. It was not a question of not supporting democratization in the Arab world, but rather having a different time frame and being ready to have a long-term commitment to support democratization and reform. The joint communication of March of 2011, I think, was an important step. It was certainly a kind of a sea change in the attitude. It had already been in the works slightly. I mean, there had been the Barcelona process, which was launched after the Madrid conference, and you know, the hope and optimism about the Middle East peace process at that time. But as you correctly noted, there were some hiccups on the road with the election of Hamas in Palestine that the European Union had spent years and a lot of money in preparing. It was recognized as free and fair, but then, sorry? Oh, okay. And I was one of those who was also very torn by this, that really it was kind of a deception by our side not to have dealings with the Hamas government at the time, and we are still feeling the consequences today. If I may, just a question to the esteemed lady from Tunisia. Tunisia was, after the counter-revolution in Egypt and the failure of the revolution in Syria and Libya and Yemen, I might add also, Tunisia was seen as the example, the hope of the Arab Spring. That this was one example where actually Europe also concentrated its resources. A lot of money and attention politically was spent on supporting the democratic process in Tunisia. Now I think it's, again, not being directly connected with the work operationally in the area, but as a kind of observer from the side, it troubles me really to see the lack of response, what I think is a lack of response from our side to what is going on now in your country. How do you see the future of democracy in Tunisia? I mean, the point which was raised by Professor Filiu, that the strategy for dealing with political Islam is allow them to take power and then to fail, and that they would have for sure the victory in the first instance, but they would lose in the second instance. That happened very well in Morocco. I mean, now they are in the opposition. In Tunisia, it happened as well, but now they're being, I mean, you can tell us, but it seems like they're being hounded into not only just the opposition, but into the underground again. And in Egypt, we know very well what happened. So what is the solution going forward for Tunisia? Thank you very much. Sorry for being too long-winded, but I just wanted to make some comments.
Thank you. I'd like to take a second question. The lady there.
Bonsoir, merci beaucoup. J'ai une question qui concerne la constitution qui a été adoptée en Tunisie après de longs débats, de longs et passionnants débats. Et quelque chose qui est ressorti de cette constitution, c'est un article sur la liberté de conscience. Alors, sur ce point-là, ce que je voudrais savoir, étant donné que ce n'est pas quelque chose qui a été suivi par d'autres pays arabo-musulmans, donc à ma connaissance, c'est vraiment la Tunisie fait figure d'exception. Est-ce que... Vous n'entendez pas? Pardon. La Tunisie fait figure d'exception par rapport à la liberté de conscience, et je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'on peut voir ça comme une anomalie quelque part, ou alors est-ce que c'est suffisamment investi par les Tunisiens pour dire que peut-être, étant donné que c'est une priorité pour les Tunisiens, ça peut peut-être le devenir pour d'autres pays dans 50 ans, dans 60 ans, etc. Donc il y a deux parties à ma question. Est-ce que c'est une priorité pour les Tunisiens, presque 10 ans après l'adoption de la Constitution? Et qu'est-ce qu'on peut dire d'autres pays musulmans par rapport à ce point-là?
Thank you. We take a third question. We're giving the floor to the speakers.
En effet, j'ai deux questions, peut-être ça va aussi. D'abord, je lis la stratégie culture, strategic culture. Et je me demande ce que ça va devenir. Est-ce que vous pouvez me donner un exemple ou quelques exemples de la culture stratégique? Je sais pas. La deuxième question, en 1960, l'Algérie a quitté l'Union européenne parce que j'étais liée à la France, donc j'étais membre de prédécesseur de l'Union européenne. Quel était, en votre opinion, les motifs à cette époque-là de quitter donc l'Union européenne et quel était le sentiment là-bas quand on est devenu membre de groupes de voisinage? Merci.
Thank you. So we'll start with you, Professor Filiu. You had first a long remark, I think. Yes, but the long remark is grounded on personal experience. Working? It's yes. Working. And I think it's very useful to hear it really from the operational room of what was going on and to your perception as a historian that you didn't feel that there was such a spontaneous solidarity and that you were left alone for a while. Yes, but at the end of the day, after 2 years, it was over, and Europe was backing it fully. I will just give you an example. I was diplomatic advisor to the Minister of Interior at the time of the fall of the wall, of the Berlin Wall. And we sent the first mission, exploratory mission of cooperation in Romania. And there, the Ministry of Interior, we started to go through the drill, and they say, oh, we have a 45 hours garde à vue, how do you call it, garde à vue? You can arrest somebody for 45 days, you know, just, and they say, oh, it's very convenient. We say it's very convenient, but it's not European. Well, we did that with Romania. Why didn't we do that with all those people who have 45 years of custody? You know, we did that. We came and we say, you're not going to have 1 penny of European money if you remain with 45 days of custody. We didn't do that in Egypt. We didn't do that in Tunisia. We didn't do that in any of those countries, even the one with the special partnerships. I mean, I'm just quoting something very, very concrete, you know. And it was not just a French diplomat going over. We were fully backed by Brussels. You know, the idea that Romania could keep somebody 45 days in custody, it's one example. But of course, you see how it resonates. I don't think the other questions were addressed to me. Maybe when you kindly say Algeria left the European, no. Algeria became independent, period. Algeria became independent, period. And there was absolutely no question of keeping special bonds with the European community at that time. Absolutely none, on both sides of the Mediterranean.
Oui. Alors, c'est difficile de parler de la Tunisie aujourd'hui, enfin, difficile d'imaginer l'avenir de la Tunisie. Mais je pense qu'on a perdu, c'est mon sentiment et c'est le sentiment de beaucoup de Tunisiens, je pense qu'on a perdu beaucoup de temps autour de sujets qui, de toute façon, étaient en grande partie résolus avant 2011. La Tunisie était une société, disons, conservatrice, plutôt équilibrée. Bon, nous sommes un certain nombre à demander plus de modernité, plus d'égalité entre les femmes et les hommes, et puis bien sûr la liberté. Bon, on ne va pas revenir sur aussi bien le règne de Bourguiba que le règne de Ben Ali, avec la différence que Bourguiba, avec l'indépendance, contrairement à l'Algérie dont on vient de parler, a jeté les bases d'un État moderne. Donc ça, c'est ce qui a persisté malgré tous les derniers bouleversements. Donc peut-être que tout le temps qu'on a consacré à réécrire une constitution pendant 3 ans nous ont éloignés des problèmes qui étaient réellement à l'origine de cette révolution de 2011, c'est-à-dire ces inégalités sociales et les disparités régionales. Donc aujourd'hui, l'avenir, c'est bien sûr de résoudre ou de limiter ces inégalités sociales et ces disparités régionales, et puis, bien sûr, de faire en sorte que les libertés individuelles soient toujours garanties et que le caractère moderne de la Tunisie ne soit pas remis en cause, parce que ça, c'est aussi ce que nous avons dû défendre depuis 2011. Alors, ce qui se passe aujourd'hui, c'est un constat d'échec, c'est vrai, c'est un constat d'échec d'un processus de transition, mais qui ne doit pas nous faire oublier ce que Jean-Pierre Filiu a bien décrit dans sa conférence, c'est que 2011, c'est une revendication de liberté qui ne date pas de quelques mois, de quelques années. C'est un problème qui s'est posé très vite, peu de temps après l'indépendance. En Tunisie, l'indépendance en 56, déjà en 61, voilà, l'opposition tunisienne, en tout cas dans le milieu étudiant, dont j'ai fait partie, manifestait contre Bourguiba, malgré ce qui les rapprochait au niveau de la modernité. Donc, je pense que la démocratie ne pouvait pas comme ça se mettre en place aussi facilement avec une succession d'élections. Ça, c'est une réalité. Maintenant, le constat aujourd'hui, bon, j'ai parlé de ces candidats au départ, mais je pourrais parler aussi de la société civile tunisienne qui est actuellement divisée sur l'avenir, c'est-à-dire sur les derniers événements et les dernières dispositions. Donc c'est pour ça qu'il est difficile même d'imaginer tout de suite, dans l'immédiat, une remobilisation de la société tunisienne sur le fait que la Constitution n'est pas respectée ou d'autres mobilisations de ce type. C'est pour ça que je pense que je persiste à redire que l'aspect économique est extrêmement important parce que c'est ce qui peut nous permettre d'éviter une sorte d'explosion quand même, à nouveau, comme ce fut le cas en 2011. Parce que c'est peut-être ça le risque. Le risque n'est peut-être pas que la société civile refasse des manifestations. Le risque, c'est réellement de ces revendications économiques qui sont très fortes. Et là, je crois que de ce côté-là, lorsqu'on parle de solidarité, c'est vraiment un plan drastique qu'il faudra engager parce qu'il y a des mesures qui n'ont pas été prises depuis 2011 et c'est dans ce sens que je dis qu'on a aussi perdu beaucoup de temps sur les décisions qu'il fallait prendre dans le domaine économique.
I will now look at the question which we received online, and I will read them and then ask the speakers to answer. Question 1. Is it possible to foresee a positive evolution of the diplomatic efforts in the Palestine-Israeli conflict? Question 2. How can the EU challenge the status quo that prevents any development in the direction of peace in the region? Question 3, is there any action European citizens and Middle East immigrants and refugees can take to help peace processes in the region? And finally, the last question, are there strategies foreseen to integrate Middle East immigrants into the local culture of the countries that open their borders to them? Professor Filiu, will you like to start?
Those questions are not about a sea, they are an ocean. by themselves. So I will just, float on the foam of the wave, and I will not be able to elaborate the answers to any one of them. Just send bullet points of reaction. The first one is that, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, every day one can be more desperate with a lot of arguments. And as I told you, I was there recently, and I've been going over there for the past 40 years, and every time I come back more depressed. Okay. So that means that we have to act, because otherwise it's going to be worse. And what I was just suggesting, the minimal option, the maximal option, would prove that Europe is willing to say we are a party not only to the managing of the conflict, which obviously is very depressing because it's not a status quo, everything is going worse, the settlement and the oppression and the occupation, and the two bureaucracies of Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in West Bank, making the Palestinian population feel that they live a nightmare inside the nightmare, a Palestinian nightmare inside the Israeli nightmare. Okay, so that means that we have to act, because if Europe considers that the two-state solution is key to its own stability, long-term stability, it's not something, then it has to take concrete steps. America will not take them. It's over. The last time they did the deal of the century was dead the next morning, the deal of the century. So we need sustained commitment. And we don't have to go to Mars. We have all the European resolution, we have the UN resolutions, we have international law. International law is very clear, and Europe is abiding to it. And we just have to prove that we stick also to this international law. That doesn't mean that we need a peace plan. No, just because the worst thing is the impasse, is to give the impression that we accept this slow, continuous deterioration. We cannot accept it. We cannot accept it as Europeans for our own sake, not because we are good peacemakers and so on and so forth. The Americans can accept it because they live on the other side of the world. We cannot. So we have to prove it. And that's it. So the other questions, I think I tried to answer the two first ones together. The other questions, it's more about integration here, which are obviously not a specialist, except that I'm an Arabist. I believe the collective level, and I have a fellow Arabist in the second row sitting in front of me, is not really what should be required in Europe. Oh, we can ask the Arabs to know more foreign languages, but we should know more about Arabic, about the Arab culture, about what it means to Europe, about our shared history, and so on and so forth. So this would be important. So of course we have to integrate the Middle Eastern immigrants in our societies, there's no doubt about it. And my Syrian friends are perfectly integrated in the countries where they've been welcome since for the past years. But also the fact that, for example, teaching Arabic should be absolutely, definitely disconnected from religion. It should be a teaching per se, that we have to not, because, you know, I won't say in which country, but you have inspector of Arabic languages, and they go to the collective kitchen, and they have been given halal menu. Well, they are teacher of Arabic. Who knows if they are Muslim? Maybe they are Muslim, maybe they are not. Maybe they are, you know, this idea that, so there's also something to work on that. And when it comes, of course, to local diasporas and Europeans, anything goes, I would say, like Woody Allen, anything goes. Any grassroots initiative that will show somewhere on the other side of the Mediterranean that we care concretely, that what happens to them is key to our future, that, you know, I've been very vocal about the Syrian revolution, and very often I was asked by people who were really eager to contribute, what could we do? I say anything, because anything will be important. Small thing, medium thing, big thing, it's important. Any message in the bottle to cross the Mediterranean is much welcome, especially now. Because believe me, if you think Russia is going to stick to Ukraine, not try to make more trouble in the Mediterranean, I can prove you wrong. I know that's not the topic, so I will stop there. But the idea that what is going on in the same way the Middle East reverberated into Ukraine, Ukraine will reverberate it in the Mediterranean realm. It's absolutely inevitable. And if it was evitable, Putin will do everything to make it happen. And until now, Putin is number one in the Kremlin.
On peut vous demander ce que vous pensez d'une meilleure connaissance des cultures arabo-musulmanes dans nos pays et d'une meilleure intégration des communautés arabo-musulmanes en Europe.
Merci de votre question, parce que je crois que il y a des choses à faire, effectivement, de très intéressantes. Bon, déjà en tant que scientifique, je dirais qu'il y a un travail important à faire des deux côtés. Pourquoi? L'Europe, où la science, on dit que la science moderne est née. Je suis scientifique et bon, je me suis particulièrement intéressée à ce grand moment de la science moderne, Copernic, la première grande révolution. Hein, ça a été un très grand moment quand on a éjecté en quelque sorte l'homme sur Terre du centre du monde. Cette grande révolution a échappé aux pays d'islam, qui pourtant avait eu aussi le grand mérite de contribuer à cette histoire universelle de la science. Et donc, je pense qu'il serait extrêmement important aujourd'hui de montrer que cette histoire de la science, pas des sciences arabes et des sciences en Europe, mais il y a une histoire continue de la science. La science avance par accumulation de connaissances. Chacun a contribué et les pays d'islam ont contribué à la science quand ils ont été intéressés par tout ce qui s'était fait avant, c'est-à-dire par l'héritage indien, grec et perse. Donc, ce serait une belle entreprise aujourd'hui de reconsidérer la manière dont l'histoire est enseignée dans vos pays et dans nos pays. Parce que, je fais une petite parenthèse, dans nos pays, le problème c'est que dans nos pays, beaucoup ont tendance, lorsqu'ils parlent de la science, à dire la science d'aujourd'hui, il ne faut pas la qualifier de science européenne, qui nous est étrangère, mais de revenir à la science islamique. Et il y a donc une certaine revendication de ce qu'on appelle l'islamisation du savoir. Ce n'est pas l'islamisation de la vie, mais c'est l'islamisation du savoir, un courant qui a émergé chez des intellectuels musulmans au dernier quart du XXe siècle. Donc, pour moi, je pense que à travers l'histoire, et bon, je découvre la force de l'histoire, c'est vrai que nous sommes en train de la découvrir. Je pense que c'est un terrain extrêmement fructueux où on ne fait de cadeau à personne, parce qu'il ne s'agit pas de faire des cadeaux à l'Europe ou aux pays d'islam en revenant sur la nostalgie de la maison de la sagesse, etc. Non, c'est beaucoup plus dans l'esprit de dire, voilà, il y a cette méthodologie scientifique, elle est partagée. La communauté scientifique n'a pas elle n'est pas attachée à un pays, à une contrée, et c'est à travers justement ce patrimoine scientifique que nous pouvons trouver des liens communs, nous pouvons retrouver la raison dans le sens où nous pouvons réfléchir à nouveau, et en quoi pour moi c'est extrêmement important parce que c'est vrai que quand même ces dernières années en tant que scientifique, je ne peux pas laisser de côté le fait que la technoscience a quand même pris une telle importance qu'elle a pu faire perdre la tête aussi à certains scientifiques. Donc, aujourd'hui, dans le cadre de toute cette réflexion sur l'avenir de la planète, sur l'utilisation des technologies, etc., je pense que la manière dont on entrevoit sa relation avec le savoir scientifique est important, que ce soit au niveau des pays du Nord ou au niveau des pays du Sud. Et là, je pense, moi, je crois beaucoup à la coopération. Je vais juste dire un mot. Quand j'ai commencé mes recherches en Tunisie, j'ai commencé à collaborer avec un laboratoire français sans aucun projet écrit. Nous avons commencé à travailler. J'ai fait des expériences dans un laboratoire français. Il n'y avait rien d'officiel. Et c'est ça le sens de la coopération. Donc peut-être que effectivement retrouver ces liens de manière profonde. Et puis, je pense aussi pour l'avenir, parce que quand je parle de l'histoire, c'est s'enrichir, mais on ne va pas revenir aux considérations scientifiques, disons, du premier cas, en tout cas du début du XXIe siècle. Et je pense aussi, tout à l'heure, quand j'ai parlé de transition verte, je pense que c'est un fort moyen de mobilisation commun à travers des projets d'avenir. C'est vraiment une forte conviction que j'ai.
Merci beaucoup. On va reprendre les questions de la salle. Je suppose qu'il y en a encore quelques-unes. Oui, madame, on va vous passer le micro.
Bonsoir. Moi, je voulais revenir sur la question qui a été posée par la personne qui était là sur la liberté de conscience en Tunisie. Si vous pouviez donc nous expliquer, bon, si c'est donc, comme elle le disait, quelque chose qui est dans la Constitution et l'intérêt, évidemment, d'avoir ça, lié à toute autre chose, qui est que dans les années 70, les années 80, il y a eu pas mal de publications, notamment de femmes tunisiennes, qui parlaient à l'époque de l'émancipation des femmes. Ces livres étaient en partie édités par la France, par des maisons d'édition françaises, ce qui permettait de lire ce qu'était leur expérience et ce qu'elles conseillaient. Alors, dans l'idée d'avoir des informations qui passent des deux côtés de la Méditerranée, est-ce qu'il y aurait des auteurs tunisiens, des femmes par exemple, qui écriraient sur la discrimination liée à la femme, liée par exemple à certains signes extérieurs qui, effectivement, dans nos pays, posent un problème, mais qu'à ce moment-là, ce ne soit pas des gens du Nord qui disent ce qu'il faut faire ou pas, mais que ce soit des gens du Sud qui expliquent à ce moment-là quelle est leur position et comment ils voient les choses, liées effectivement à la liberté de conscience. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Are there other questions, please?
So you are all convinced?
Yes, we have a question here for Professor Filiu.
Thank you. I think it's my duty to answer the question addressed before by one of the participants regarding the link between the splendid presentation we had today the session about the relation with the Mediterranean neighbors with the title of the cycle, which is Toward a Common European Strategic Culture. The lady said, what is the strategic culture, European? This cycle of conference, I remember, is the outcome of a cooperation between the Academy of Science and the European External Action Service. And we have had the intervention of Ala Olium here. On behalf, we had Mr. Borrell at the first opening conference in October. So after 4 sessions online, we meet again. We are happy to say that we need this kind of meetings regarding relation with neighbors in order to understand our strategic culture. For instance, the proposal by Filiu, Professor Filiu, of a strong initiative, political initiative regarding Palestine, because what you proposed is an extremely good example of developing a common strategic culture in Europe regarding the future of Palestine. You know that the debate in the European External Action Service is about strategic autonomy. And unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is fostering and deepening the development of a strategic autonomy and the defense strategic autonomy of the European Union. So we try to look at the conditions, internal conditions and external conditions for Europe to be an independent, more autonomous actor in international relations. And for that, we have several sessions focusing on the domestic internal preconditions. We started looking at the European socio-economic model in October, and next session on 30th of May will be on the digital power shifts and the role of regulating role of the European Union in international relations. So these are the internal preconditions, economic and social preconditions, but we need to look and to interact with the external challenges and look whether there is a convergence between Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, regarding how to address this challenge. I think is very well, for instance, Ala Olium is Estonian. From Baltic and Scandinavian point of view, you can come to a deep interest in the Mediterranean. And from the Iberic and Mediterranean countries, we came to a common interest for, let me say, defending Ukraine now and the future for a pan-European architecture of security. That are small steps toward a common strategic culture, which needs shared analysis and also shared common consideration of the challenges. For instance, the concept of shared destiny in Mediterranean is extremely relevant for the strategic autonomies. There is a shared destiny in the Mediterranean. With the concept you use, it is extremely provocative under this respect. There is an immense literature about the common shared destiny in the Mediterranean. So I think this session provides an excellent input for our, I would put a question mark, for our future or for the process of building of a common strategic culture. So I hope to have answered your legitimate question.
I understand it was more a remark than a question, really.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Any remark or question before we would conclude? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, citizens. Angelos Harlaftis, Epafos Advisors, who represent Rigas Ferreos Group, which is working for the last 40 years in the Southeastern Europe and Mediterranean. We have around 10,000 members and in South Mediterranean. The question is to the lady, what are the relations of the Tunisian scientific community with the Algerian and the Moroccan one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question? No. So, well, I think that it's more probably to Professor Sharfi that I have to address those two questions. Il y avait donc, comme vous le savez, une première question sur l'émancipation des femmes et la question maintenant qui vient d'être posée.
Alors, sur la question de l'émancipation des femmes, elle date d'avant l'indépendance aussi. Donc, je voudrais rappeler quand même que les féministes ont existé aussi bien en Tunisie qu'en Égypte au début du XXe siècle. Et chez nous, donc la fameuse Manoubia Ouarteni avait fait cette fameuse conférence et elle avait enlevé le voile. Et un avocat était là, c'était Bourguiba. Il n'avait pas tellement apprécié qu'à l'époque, donc 1929, on se mobilise sur la question de la modernité alors que la priorité, c'était l'indépendance. Mais les femmes ont continué leur chemin. Alors c'est vrai que bon, le code du statut personnel a quand même été une chance pour la Tunisie. Hein. Bon, moi j'ai vécu l'indépendance parce que j'étais déjà en fin de lycée au moment de l'indépendance. Mais la question de la liberté de conscience, c'est vrai qu'elle a toujours été présente parce que malgré la modernité de Bourguiba, la Tunisie n'a jamais été un pays laïque. La constitution tunisienne ne dit pas que la Tunisie est un pays musulman, mais il dit que la religion est l'islam. Alors ça, c'est l'ambiguïté de Bourguiba, c'est la religion de la Tunisie. Alors nous disons que c'est le caractère social en fait. L'islam est la religion des Tunisiens sur le plan sociologique, mais les islamistes disent non, la Tunisie est musulmane, donc l'islam est réellement la religion d'État, quoi. Bon, donc ça, c'est une question que Bourguiba, il avait fait consciemment ce choix. Il ne voulait pas faire le choix de Kemal Atatürk, de la laïcité claire de la Turquie. On peut s'interroger sur ces deux choix parce que peut se dire qu'aujourd'hui, la Turquie, malgré tout ce qui arrive, si vous allez en ce moment en Turquie, en plein mois de Ramadan, eh bien, vous allez trouver les cafés ouverts, les restaurants ouverts. Il n'y a pas cette polarisation sur les pratiques religieuses. Hein. Bon, ça, c'est une petite remarque que je fais. Mais donc, si Bourguiba n'est pas allé jusqu'à la laïcité, il a quand même été profondément convaincu de l'émancipation des femmes, sans être quand même le véritable défenseur des libertés, dont la liberté de conscience. Et donc, déjà, certains problèmes liés aux pratiques religieuses du Ramadan étaient déjà posés du temps des années de Bourguiba. Moi, j'ai vécu ça, hein, déjà dans les années 60, donc très tôt après l'indépendance. Ce qu'a ajouté la Constitution de 2014, c'est qu'elle a clairement garanti la liberté de conscience. Mais il faut avoir une lecture attentive de l'article, c'est l'article 6, je crois, de la Constitution, donc qui garantit la liberté de conscience, mais qui n'empêche pas que l'on puisse attaquer un Tunisien pour blasphème. Donc, vous voyez que à chaque fois, dans chaque article, on accorde une liberté, mais on la retire aussi de l'autre. C'est la Constitution de 2014 et comme ça, à chaque fois qu'il y a eu des avancées, il y a eu aussi des concessions qui ont été faites à ceux qui ne voulaient pas justement faire de la Tunisie un véritable parti laïque. Mais le mouvement des femmes est quand même très fort en Tunisie, pas seulement le mouvement des femmes. il y a un certain nombre de Tunisiens qui considèrent qu'il y a effectivement, nécessairement, égalité entre les hommes et les femmes, même si la succession est inégalitaire en Tunisie, il y a un certain nombre de familles où la succession se fait de manière égalitaire entre les enfants. Donc, de ce côté-là, il y a quand même... je pense que la Tunisie reste quand même un pays très différent des autres pays arabes. Et les femmes tunisiennes ne sont pas prêtes à céder leurs droits. Pour ça, elles ressortiront dans la rue si ça se présente. Alors, la question sur la coopération scientifique est effectivement importante parce que il n'y a pas beaucoup de coopération scientifique entre les chercheurs du Maghreb, entre eux. D'abord, le Maghreb, ma génération a cru au Maghreb, a cru réellement au fait que nous pouvions constituer une force dans cette Afrique du Nord. Nous ne nous sentions pas différents, Algériens, Marocains, Tunisiens, puis nous avons vécu ensemble les luttes pour l'indépendance, donc ça c'était très fort. Mais malheureusement, les gouvernements n'ont pas voulu de cette unification du Maghreb et, bon, bien sûr, l'Algérie s'étendant largement de chaque côté, Bourguiba d'un côté, Hassan II de l'autre, enfin bon, il y avait de multiples raisons, malheureusement, qui ont fait que aujourd'hui l'idée de Maghreb est bien loin derrière nous, c'est plutôt l'idée de guerre qui est menaçante entre la partie ouest du Maghreb. Mais par ailleurs, on aurait pu s'attendre à ce que cette idée du Maghreb uni renforce les relations entre les chercheurs marocains, algériens et tunisiens. Ça n'a pas été le cas. Il y a quelques rencontres, on appelle ça maghrébines, mais là aussi, bon, vous savez, la recherche scientifique dans nos pays est quelque chose de tout à fait nouveau. Ce qui existait dans les pays du Maghreb, je parle de manière générale, c'était beaucoup plus un peu de recherche médicale, les instituts Pasteur, donc à travers la colonisation, qui ont vraiment initié une politique de recherche scientifique dans le domaine de la biologie, et puis l'agronomie aussi pour des intérêts, de toute façon, aussi bien en médecine qu'en agriculture, les forces coloniales avaient tout intérêt à développer ces deux secteurs de recherche. Mais la recherche proprement dite, je veux dire sans aucune idée d'intérêt direct, en physique par exemple, vous dire en Tunisie, le premier laboratoire de physique a été créé en 1974, donc c'est vraiment un phénomène tout à fait nouveau. Et donc, une coopération sud-sud, nous la considérions, moi je reconnais être parmi ceux qui n'ont pas favorisé cette coopération sud-sud, parce que voilà, on avait besoin de cette coopération sud-nord pour avancer, pour participer à des colloques, pour pouvoir faire des expériences qui n'étaient pas réalisables dans nos pays. Et donc, que ce soit sur le plan politique ou sur le plan humain, c'est vrai qu'il a manqué cette volonté. Peut-être qu'aujourd'hui, c'est un peu regrettable que nous n'ayons pas mis en commun notre envie de faire avancer la recherche en Tunisie. Peut-être qu'à travers l'écologie, peut-être, bon, c'est possible. C'est possible que les jeunes auront plus envie de partager des projets d'avenir. C'est possible, mais c'est pas certain. Finalement, chacun travaille pour son pays, et ça, Jean-Pierre, tu le sais bien. Voilà, c'est que ce soit au Maghreb ou au Proche-Orient. Hein,
A last remark by Professor Filiu.
Yes, I just want to echo what Mariotello said, and I think we all know now with Ukraine that we are at a critical turning point. And more than ever, we need this common strategic culture. Again, it's not something, it's not a menu, you know, oh no, I don't take dessert, I don't take strategic culture. No. We need this strategic culture. And if we're talking about the south of the Mediterranean, strangely enough, never had the opportunity of a strategic culture been more promising, because it's over. America is out. Of course, it's not out 100%. I think, by the way, we'll pay the two bills, because they are out as a structuring power, but they don't want to let go. So they don't want Europe to interfere too much in what they consider is their backyard. Yes, but they're out historically. And we will be in and more and more and more in. And Russia and China have absolutely no vision to propose to this part of the world. And what this part of the world needs is no more war, no more violence, no more inequity. They have been, they have the world record of that. Huh? What they need is norms. And Europe has a capacity, but sometimes it's afraid of its own shadow, to project norms. And those norms could just change the life of tens and even hundreds of millions of people in this part of the world, because what they need is norms, social norms, juridical norms. And Europe, and Europe cannot be just considered as a banker, cannot be just considered as a norm producer, but all this together, and this is why the strategy is, the strategic culture is so key, because it means a collective vision. And to conclude, one of the worst moments of the non-strategic vision regarding the Southern Mediterranean was when the former President Sarkozy said, we will make a union for the Mediterranean only with the European member states who are on the shore of the Mediterranean. That was a devastating blow, a backlash, because the whole Euro-Mediterranean process has been trying to build this collective strategic culture between every European state and the South. And I'm sure, and everything I read from the internal papers, because I have access to some, but also from the speeches, of course, of Vice-President Borrell, but also of the other leaders here in Brussels, is very promising. And I do believe, because if historians can have a little bit of faith in the future, we are not only studying the past, that the Ukraine moment is also a moment for Europe in the south, in the Mediterranean. At least that's the hope I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Before we adjourn, two administrative information. There was a session planned on the 14th of March on the relation of the EU with Russia and the Eastern neighbourhood. Because of different events, the session has been postponed to the fall 2022. Secondly, the next session will take place on the 30th of May and will be dedicated to digital power shifts and EU regulations rules. I thank you all. I hope you enjoyed the session. It is a lot of food for thought, and we will probably be able to circulate the paper of Professor Filiu. I wish you a good evening. Thank you.